The year was 1942. The Eastern Front wasn't just a battlefield, it was an icy wasteland. The cold seemed endless. Temperatures dropped to life-threatening levels. 40 degrees Celsius in this environment, even breathing hurt. The air burned the lungs like invisible blades, and each drop of sweat froze the instant it appeared. The roads, once dirt and mud, were now swallowed by a thick layer of snow. Head toward Moscow were now nothing more than immobile giants. Their tracks seized like helpless children. Many were without proper clothing, thin boots, capes that barely cut the wind. They froze, standing up, rifles in hand, transforming themselves into statues of flesh and ice. Some fell asleep from exhaustion, never to wake up, dead in silence, covered by the ever-falling snow. The cold was unforgiving. Wounded men who might otherwise have survived succumbed within minutes. The simple task of lighting a fire became a desperate struggle, their brittle fingers no longer responding. Even their weapons malfunctioned. Ice seeped into the stocks of rifles, and bayonets stuck to their skin, tearing chunks of flesh as the men tried to free them. It was in this white hell, in this scenario that seemed more hostile than any enemy, that the story of Demjansk Stock Exchange began to be written. It wasn't just the war between Germans and Soviets, it was also the war against nature itself, against the murderous cold that turned men into frozen corpses and machines into useless monuments in the snow. The deadly winter of 1942 waited for no one. He simply devoured everything, men, tanks, courage, and hope. And it was in this icy abyss that the Wehrmacht soldiers discovered. In the summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. Its motorized divisions sliced across the plains of the Soviet Union. But the arrogance of victory hid a poison. Every kilometer conquered was also a burden. Supply lines stretched like a rope about to snap. Trucks got stuck on muddy roads. Horses died pulling heavy cannons, and ammunition began to run low. Still, the German command ordered, "Move forward, always move forward." In the heart of Russia, Wehrmacht divisions were spread too thin, small too deep into the forest, without realizing that they no longer know the way back. And as the Germans moved further and further away from their bases, the Russian winter approached like a patient executioner. Supplies dwindled, reinforcements failed to arrive in time, and every soldier felt in his heart a silent truth: the Wehrmacht was gone too far. It was in this fragile position that they found themselves in early 1942, as the Red Army, reeling from its initial shock, prepared a massive counterattack. What had seemed like the glorious advance of a perfect war machine would turn into a death trap, and Demyansk would be the stage where this mistake would exact a terrible price. If history came alive for you today, subscribe now and march with us into the next battle. In January 1942, as German soldiers shivered in the trenches of Demyansk and along the stretched lines, the Red Army finally regained its breath. The Russians, hardened by months of defeats and massive losses, launched a brutal and calculated offensive, taking advantage of every logistical failure of the Wehrmacht. The sound of Soviet artillery cut through the icy silence like thunder, blasting snow and earth into white clouds of smoke and ice. And the ice had already weakened the defenders. Soviet soldiers advanced in columns, often crawling through the snow to enemy trenches, attacking with bayonets and grenades. Snowstorms favored the attackers. Visibility was minimal, and isolated Germans could barely see the incoming fire. Every village, every forest, every road became a slaughterhouse. For the Germans, the siege wasn't immediate. It was gradual, silent, and suffocating. An isolated detachment here, another there, until the Soviets closed the ring around Demyansk. The encircled troops realized with horror there were no escape routes. The cold was already killing slowly. Now hunger and the physical enemy completed the death sentence. The ice, already an invisible enemy, now mingled with fire and gunpowder. Every man in the Wehrmacht felt the siege tighten, and the once confident spirit began to waver. The white nightmare, silent and deadly, now became a living, breathing nightmare, with explosions, screams, and frozen blood splattered across the floor. The winter that had previously been merely cold now became a weapon, and the enemy coming from the south and east approached without mercy. Soviet counter-siege forms. With the Soviets advancing relentlessly, the siege of Demjansk began to consolidate. More than 90,000 German soldiers, including units of the Wehrmacht, SS, and Latvian auxiliaries, were trapped in a small frozen territory. There were no escape routes, no guaranteed supplies, just snow, cold, and enemies on all sides. The soldiers quickly realized that they were isolated from the world communication lines, with the rest of the army were cut. Radio messages arrived late or not at all, and every attempt to send reinforcements resulted in deaths along the way. Supply convoys were buried in the snow, ambushed by the enemy or destroyed by artillery. The surrounding villages and forests were turned into fields of permanent conflict. Every tree could hide a Soviet sniper, every building a deadly ambush. Surrounded soldiers walked over the frozen bodies of their comrades, fighting despair and the cold. Many succumbed without ever firing a shot. The siege was a living ice prison tents. Makeshift trenches and destroyed buildings were insufficient protection from the biting cold. The air was already thick with fear and hunger. With each passing day, the feeling of helplessness grew, and the Wehrmacht began to realize that surviving would be harder than fighting. Demjansk wasn't just a place on the map, it was a death trap. The men faced not only the Soviets, but also nature itself. Snow buried supplies, froze weapons, and the wind carried away any heat they tried to generate. The siege was complete, and with it began the real frozen nightmare, the Wehrmacht. The past must never be forgotten. Subscribe and relive the battles that changed the world. Winter in Demjansk wasn't just cold, it was a silent killer men who still had the courage to fight and began to succumb to the ice before even facing enemy fire. Fingers, noses, ears, and feet froze quickly, forming black wounds and gangrene. Every step was a battle against their own bodies, which refused to obey. The makeshift tents offered little shelter. Soldiers piled snow on the sides, burned wood, or furniture scraps to keep warm. But the cold always won. On the ground, snow accumulated inside the trenches, turning every sheltered space into an icy trap. Sleep was dangerous. Sleep could mean death, for the body slowly froze while men dreamed of their homes, families, and a summer that never seemed to come. Fear and hopelessness also gnawed at the spirit. Many fell into delirium, screaming for food, shelter, or water, and sometimes died while still awake, frozen in the instant. Even weapons became enemies. Bayonets stuck to skin, ropes froze, artillery cords broke, and grenades often failed to detonate. The horror did not come only from the visible enemy. The real enemy, invisible and implacable, was thrown Russian winter. It attacked men, animals, and machines with equal brutality. Every gust of wind cut like a blade. Every blizzard concealed Soviet attacks or treacherous holes in the ground. And so, as the siege tightened, the Wehrmacht soldiers learned the hard way. The war in Demjansk would not be won with rifles and tactics alone. To survive, they had to face the terror of winter itself, where every hour could be the last. The Demjansk Pocket, a dark and brutal chapter on the Eastern Front during World War II, represented an extreme test of human resilience and military tenacity. Formed in February 1942, when some 100,000 German soldiers, including elements of the 2nd Army Corps and parts of ex-Army Corps, were surrounded by Soviet forces south of Leningrad, this encirclement was not just a battle of arms, but a relentless struggle against the elements, shortages, and survival itself. Demjansk's strategic importance was multifaceted. For the Germans, it was a vital position that protected the rear of the 16th Army and served as a forward base for future offensives toward Moscow or Leningrad. For the Soviets, eliminating the pocket represented an opportunity to dismantle Army Group North's front and pave the way for significant advances. Real stories, bloody, unforgettable. Search for warmth was a daily and desperate obsession. Precarious campfires made with whatever combustible material was available, damp wood, scraps of equipment, even furniture from abandoned houses, were beacons of hope and at the same time easy targets for Soviet artillery, which could spot the smoke from miles away. The cold not only killed physically, but also sapped morale, reasoning ability, motor coordination, and unit cohesion, transforming sturdy, trained men into hunched, shivering and apathetic figures, more concerned with surviving the next minute than fighting the enemy. The fight against the elements was a parallel war, as exhausting, if not more so, than the fight against the Soviets. The appeal to high command, between distant hope and harsh reality. As the days of siege piled up and the situation became untenable, the German generals in the pocket, led by figures such as General Walter Graf von Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt, commander of the Second Army Corps, realized the extreme gravity of the situation. Urgent and increasingly desperate messages were sent to Hitler and the Wehrmacht High Command, OKW. The men were exhausted, hungry, freezing, and non-combat casualties outnumbered battle losses. The Wehrmacht encircled in Demjansk needed immediate and decisive help. In the field, officers tore up letters and reports outlining every risk in grim detail. The critical lack of supplies, the impossibility of ground reinforcements due to the swampy and snow-covered terrain, which made the movement of heavy vehicles and troops nearly impossible, and the fierce Soviet resistance that blocked any attempt at ground relief. Each report detailed catastrophic losses of personnel, ammunition shortages, and the progressive collapse of morale. With each line, the urgency grew, but the response from the distant command, especially Hitler, was slow, distant, and for many at the front, cruelly detached from reality. Hitler, confident in his own strategic vision and influenced by the initial success of the Blitzkrieg, as well as by the belief in the superiority of the German will, responded with an almost arrogant determination. "You will hold out. The Luftwaffe will keep you alive." Words that sounded like a promise of salvation, but for the encircled soldiers, they were a sentence of uncertain survival, dependent on an aerial miracle. The idea of relying solely on aviation amidst blizzards, fog, and growing Soviet air superiority seemed almost absurd, a strategic delusion, but it was their only remaining hope. Meanwhile, within the encirclement, the soldiers felt that the outside world had forgotten them, that they were expendable pawns on a distant chessboard. Each new day was a struggle to stay warm, find food, and resist Soviet attacks, which grew bolder as German weakness became apparent. The appeal to high command was a silent cry of desperation, echoing across snowy trails, frozen trenches, and desolate battlefields. But the response came only in vague promises of airborne supplies, a solution that depended on planes crossing the white hell against wind, snow, ice, and enemy fire. The contrast between the deadly cold that slowly killed and the hope of an airborne rescue created an almost unbearable tension, a duality between brutal reality and distant promise. Each man knew that, even if he survived the winter and the enemy, relying on high command meant trusting in miracles in the midst of a frozen nightmare, a desperate gamble against the odds. The Soviet offensive's constant pressure and the aim of annihilation. On the Soviet side, the siege of Demjansk was the result of a series of winter offensives, part of the general counteroffensive following the Battle of Moscow. The Demjansk offensive operation, launched in January 1942 by Lieutenant General Pavel Kurochkin, commander of the Northwestern Front, had as its primary objective to cut the German 16th Army's lines of communication and annihilate enemy forces in the region. The Soviet forces involved included the 11th Army, the 1st Shock Army, and the 1st and 2nd Guards Rifle Corps, with later support from the 3rd and 4th Shock Armies of the Kalinin Front. The intention was to create a massive encirclement, and although the swampy and snow-covered terrain hampered the advance, Soviet persistence succeeded in isolating the German forces. The Soviets launched continuous and ferocious attacks against the pocket, seeking to reduce it and prevent any attempt at escape or rescue. The pressure was constant, with heavy artillery, infantry attacks, and, as time permitted, air support. For Stalin, the elimination of the Demjansk Pocket was an important milestone in dismantling the German front and demonstrating the Red Army's ability to encircle and destroy large enemy formations. The fighting was brutal and relentless, with both sides suffering heavy casualties in hand-to-hand combat in the frozen trenches and dense forests surrounding the pocket. The Demjansk airlift, a costly precedent and the illusion of salvation. Despite Hitler's promises, the Demjansk airlift was a massive operation and a crucial precedent for future events, but it was also a colossal drain on resources. The Luftwaffe mobilized a sizable fleet of transport aircraft, primarily the rugged and reliable Junkers Ju-52, to deliver vital supplies, ammunition, food, fuel and medicine, and evacuate the wounded. Between February and May 1942, some 59,000 tons of supplies and 31,000 replacement troops were delivered, while 36,000 wounded were evacuated. An impressive logistical feat under adverse conditions. However, the cost was exorbitant and unsustainable in the long term. The Luftwaffe lost 265 aircraft, including 106 Junkers Ju-52s, 17 Heinkel He-111s, and 2 Junkers Ju-86, as well as 387 experienced aviators. Richard Overy described this operation as a Pyrrhic victory, highlighting the loss of more than 200 aircraft and their crews at a time when annual transport production was only 500, all to save a contingent of 90,000 soldiers, many of whom were already dead, wounded, or incapacitated for service. The success, albeit costly and temporary, of the Demjansk airlift unfortunately reinforced Hitler and Hermann Göring's belief in the effectiveness of airlift in holding encircled troops. This belief, based on an optimistic and distorted interpretation of reality, would be tragically replicated and would fail catastrophically in the Battle of Stalingrad. There, the German 6th Army, surrounded and with much greater needs, estimated at 750 tons per day, compared to Demjansk's 270 tons per day, could not be saved by the exhausted Luftwaffe and facing overwhelming Soviet air superiority, leading to its surrender and the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives, one of the most decisive turning points of the war. The relief and legacy of Demjansk, a symbol of sacrifice and strategic error. The Demjansk Pocket was finally relieved in April 1942 when a land corridor, the Ramushevo Corridor, was opened by German forces under General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, allowing connection with the main lines. However, fighting in the area continued until February 1943, when German forces staged an organized withdrawal, abandoning the pocket. Although the operation was considered a German defensive victory at immense human and material cost, it became a symbol of Hitler's stubbornness and willingness to sacrifice vast resources and lives for questionable strategic principles. The experience of Demjansk, with its hunger, cold, desperation, the brutality of the fighting, and the heroic but unsustainable airlift, echoed on subsequent battlefields, serving as a grim omen for the fate of many other German units on the Eastern Front. The historical weight of Demjansk lies not only in the brutality of the siege itself, but in how its lessons, or lack thereof, shaped decisions that would lead to even greater disasters for the Wehrmacht, culminating in the catastrophe of Stalingrad and contributing to the progressive attrition of German forces in the east. Demjansk is a vivid reminder of the human cost. Here, every video is a trench, dug deep into history. Subscribe and stand shoulder to shoulder with us. The Demjansk Pocket, a name that resonates with the brutality and tenacity of the Eastern Front during World War II, was not merely a military encirclement, but a microcosm of the existential struggle that defined that conflict. Formed in February 1942, when approximately 100,000 German soldiers, including the elite 2 Army Corps and elements of ex-Army Corps, found themselves trapped by Soviet forces south of Leningrad, this episode transcended mere military strategy to become a saga of survival against the elements, shortages, and the very nature of war. Demjansk's strategic importance was multifaceted and crucial. For the German High Command, it represented a vital anchor in the rear of the 16th Army, an advanced stronghold that could serve as a springboard for future offensives toward Leningrad or Moscow, or as a holding point against Soviet counterattacks. For the Soviets, the annihilation of the pocket was not just a tactical issue, but a moral and strategic imperative to dismantle Army Group North's front and pave the way for decisive advances, reaffirming the Red Army's ability to encircle and destroy large enemy formations. The battle for Demjansk, therefore, was not just about territory, but about morale, will, and the very narrative of the war in the East. The winter scenario of 1941 to 1942, the collapse of Blitzkrieg, and the birth of the pocket. To understand the formation of the Demjansk Pocket, it is imperative to go back to the final months of 1941 and early 1942. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, had stalled at the gates of Moscow. The Russian winter, with its freezing temperatures and relentless blizzards, not only paralyzed the German war machine, but also allowed the Red Army, reinvigorated and adapted to the climate, to launch a series of devastating counteroffensives. The German 16th Army, part of Army Group North, was stretched to its limit, its supply lines frozen, and its men exhausted. In January 1942, the Soviets, under the command of Lieutenant General Pavel Kurochkin, launched the Demyansk offensive. The objective was ambitious: to cut German lines of communication and encircle large enemy formations. Soviet forces, including the 11th Army, the 1st Shock Army, and the 1st and 2nd Guards Rifle Corps, advanced through marshy, snow-covered terrain that, while hampering their own movement, also impeded German maneuver. Soviet persistence, coupled with German exhaustion and lack of winter preparation, resulted in the isolation of 7 German divisions and supporting units, forming what would become known as the Demjansk Pocket. This encirclement was no accident, but the direct result of a successful Soviet counteroffensive and Hitler's stubbornness in prohibiting any retreat, ordering troops to hold their positions at all costs. Hitler's decision to turn Demjansk into a fortress rather than allow a tactical retreat sealed the fate of tens of thousands of men and set the stage for one of the most dramatic encirclement battles of the war. Hunger and scarcity, the silent, persistent enemy that eats away the soul. As the siege deepened, hunger emerged as an adversary as lethal as Soviet cannons or the biting cold, but with a more insidious cruelty, corroding not only the bodies, but also the very souls of the soldiers. Food rations, already precarious since the onset of the Russian winter, quickly ran out, turning subsistence into a daily, harrowing battle. Stale bread, often reduced to nearly pulverized crumbs, was shared sparingly, each portion a reminder of the precariousness of existence. The search for any edible organic matter became an obsession. Soup made from tree bark, bitter roots, weeds, and even moss was the staple. Food, a testament to the desperate ingenuity of survival in extreme conditions. Horse meat, sourced from animals killed in combat or slaughtered for food, often undercooked and difficult to digest, was a rare but essential delicacy, though its availability was limited. Stomachs grumbled in a constant chorus of pain, and bodies wasted away, losing weight and strength by the day. Desperation begat more despair, and morale, once unshakable, began to crumble. Soldiers who had once marched with confidence and vigor now shuffled slowly, their hollow eyes reflecting exhaustion, malnutrition, and the relentless struggle to stay alive until the next dawn. Energy evaporated, bones ached from the cold and lack of nutrients, and each step was an agony against extreme weakness. Hunger didn't kill quickly, but it slowly eroded the will to fight, discipline, and morale, leaving behind only the primal instinct for survival. Disputes over small rations of food became common, with men fighting, often physically, for a piece of bread or a can of frozen soup. The ice, while preserving the meager food, transformed each ration into a priceless treasure, paid for with blood and sweat. While the cold slowly reaped those who succumbed to freezing, hunger killed those who could still move but were on the verge of collapse. Each missed meal was a step deeper into the abyss of annihilation. Winter, famine, and the siege formed a deadly trio. A visible enemy, the Soviets; an invisible enemy, hunger and disease; and an internal enemy, despair and the loss of the will to fight, that attacked body and mind simultaneously. In Demjansk, each soldier understood a terrifying truth. The war was not just fought on the battlefields, but within their own bodies, a struggle against hunger, weakness, and cold. Survival was not just about resisting the enemy, but also about resisting oneself, one's own physical and psychological limits, in a scenario where human dignity was constantly challenged. The relentless cold, a cruel ally of the enemy and the battle against the elements. The Russian winter, legendary for its ferocity and relentlessness, inflicted untold suffering on the encircled troops, transforming the landscape into a white hell. Temperatures that plummeted to tens of degrees below zero turned the air into razor blades, where every breath was a searing pain, and every touch of bare metal could mean the irreversible loss of a limb. The snow, which fell incessantly and reached considerable heights, not only hampered movement and visibility, making military operations nearly impossible, but also seeped into trenches and makeshift shelters, freezing everything and everyone. Clothing, designed for a milder European climate and unsuitable for such Siberian rigors, offered little or no protection against the piercing cold. Severe frostbite, gangrene, and hypothermia became common causes of casualties, often more effective than enemy bullets, claiming lives and incapacitating soldiers en masse. The simple act of existing outdoors for long periods was a constant torture, and the search for warmth was a daily and desperate obsession. Precarious campfires, made with whatever combustible material was available, damp wood, scraps of equipment, even furniture from abandoned houses, were beacons of hope, and, at the same time, easy targets for Soviet artillery, which could spot the smoke from miles away. The cold not only killed physically, but also sapped morale, reasoning ability, motor coordination, and unit cohesion, transforming sturdy, trained men into hunched, trembling, and apathetic figures, more concerned with surviving the next minute than fighting the enemy. The fight against the elements was a parallel war, as grueling, if not more so, than the fight against the Soviets, a constant battle against nature that tested the limits of human endurance. The appeal to high command, between distant hope and the cruel reality of an unyielding Führer. As the days of siege piled up and the situation became untenable, the German generals in the pocket, led by figures such as General Walter Graf von Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt, commander of the 2 Army Corps, realized the extreme gravity of the situation. Urgent and increasingly desperate messages were sent to Hitler and the Wehrmacht High Command, OKW. The men were exhausted, hungry, freezing, and non-combat casualties outnumbered battle losses. The Wehrmacht encircled in Demjansk needed immediate and decisive help. In the field, officers tore up letters and reports, outlining every risk in grim detail, the critical lack of supplies, the impossibility of ground reinforcements due to the swampy and snow-covered terrain, which made the movement of heavy vehicles and troops nearly impossible, and the fierce Soviet resistance that blocked any attempt at ground relief. Each report detailed catastrophic losses of personnel, ammunition shortages, and the progressive collapse of morale. With each line, the urgency grew, but the response from the distant command, especially Hitler, was slow, distant, and, for many at the front, cruelly detached from reality. Hitler, confident in his own strategic vision and influenced by the initial success of the Blitzkrieg, as well as by the belief in the superiority of the German will, responded with an almost arrogant determination: "You will hold out. The Luftwaffe will keep you alive." Words that sounded like a promise of salvation, but for the encircled soldiers, they were a sentence of uncertain survival, dependent on an aerial miracle. The idea of relying solely on aviation amidst blizzards, fog, and growing Soviet air superiority seemed almost absurd, a strategic delusion, but it was their only remaining hope. Meanwhile, within the encirclement, the soldiers felt that the outside world had forgotten them, that they were expendable pawns on a distant chessboard. Each new day was a struggle to stay warm, find food, and resist Soviet attacks, which grew bolder as German weakness became apparent. The appeal to high command was a silent cry of desperation, echoing across snowy trails, frozen trenches, and desolate battlefields. But the response came only in vague promises of airborne supplies, a solution that depended on planes crossing the white hell against wind, snow, ice, and enemy fire. The contrast between the deadly cold that slowly killed and the hope of an airborne rescue created an almost unbearable tension, a duality between brutal reality and distant promise. Each man knew that even if they survived the winter and the enemy, relying on high command meant trusting in miracles in the midst of a frozen nightmare, a desperate gamble against the odds. Hitler's inflexibility, refusing to give an inch of ground, transformed Demjansk from a tactical setback into a test of will, with devastating consequences for the Wehrmacht. The Soviet offensives, constant pressure, and the goal of total annihilation. On the Soviet side, the siege of Demjansk was the culmination of a series of meticulously planned winter offensives, part of the general counteroffensive after the Battle of Moscow, aimed at driving back the German invaders and regaining strategic momentum. The Demjansk offensive, launched in January 1942 by Lieutenant General Pavel Kurochkin, commander of the Northwestern Front, had as its primary objective not only to sever the German 16th Army's lines of communication, but also to completely annihilate enemy forces in the region, opening a breach in the German front. The Soviet forces involved were sizable and determined, including the 11th Army, the 1st Shock Army, and the 1st and 2nd Guards Rifle Corps, with later support from the 3rd and 4th Shock Armies of the Kalinin Front. The intention was to create a massive, hermetic encirclement, and although the swampy, snow-covered terrain hampered the advance, Soviet persistence and resilience succeeded in isolating the German forces. The Soviets launched continuous, ferocious attacks against the pocket, seeking to reduce it and prevent any attempt at escape or rescue. The pressure was constant, with heavy artillery barrages, waves of infantry attacks, and, as time permitted, air support. For Stalin, the elimination of the Demjansk Pocket was an important milestone in dismantling the German front, demonstrating the Red Army's ability to encircle and destroy large enemy formations and boosting national morale. The fighting was brutal and relentless, with both sides suffering heavy casualties in hand-to-hand combat in the frozen trenches and dense forests surrounding the pocket. With each passing day, the Soviet ring tightened and German hope dwindled, turning the pocket into a meat grinder where life was cheap and death a constant. The Luftwaffe airlift, the deadly flights, the illusion of salvation, and the price of stubbornness. With the men trapped, starving and freezing, the Wehrmacht's only hope was the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, as the last, desperate line of survival. For the first time in modern military history, Germany was attempting to keep an entire pocket of troops isolated by air alone. A logistical operation of epic proportions and a calculated risk that would prove to be a dangerous precedent. Thousands of tons of food, ammunition, fuel, medical equipment and spare parts had to traverse snowstorms, enemy artillery and hostile territory to reach the encircled areas. The Luftwaffe mobilized a considerable fleet of transport aircraft, primarily the rugged and reliable Junkers Ju-52, nicknamed Tante Ju, Aunt Ju, and also deployed Heinkel He 111 bombers adapted for transport. These planes took off every day, often carrying more weight than their wings could support, in a desperate race against time and the elements. Each flight was a game of Russian roulette in the skies. Icy winds and severe turbulence shook the planes. Frost froze instruments and engines, turning every takeoff and landing into a near suicidal act of courage. Pilots had to navigate through blinding clouds, dense fog, and relentless blizzards, always under constant threat from Soviet fighters and increasingly effective anti-aircraft artillery. With each approach to Demjansk, the men on board knew they might not return. Many planes never returned, smashed into pieces in the ice or burned out, scattering wreckage and bodies across the endless white Russian landscape. The human and material cost was exorbitant and unsustainable in the long term. Between February and May 1942, some 59,000 tons of supplies and 31,000 replacement troops were delivered, while 36,000 wounded were evacuated, an impressive logistical feat under adverse conditions. However, the Luftwaffe lost 265 aircraft, including 106 Junkers Ju-52s, 17 Heinkel He 111s, and 2 Junkers Ju-86, along with 387 experienced aviators. For the soldiers on the ground, each arriving plane was a promise of life, a thin thread of hope. Each supply shipment saved hundreds of men, but it was never enough to meet the estimated daily requirements of 270 tons. Food was quickly rationed. Every sack of flour, every can of meat was fought over like gold. Morale depended directly on these deadly flights, but uncertainty loomed. How many days before the airlift failed? How many planes would be shot down tomorrow? Terror and hope mingled, while the Soviets held positions all around, prepared to attack at the slightest sign of weakness. The Germans depended on planes flying through the white hell to avoid becoming frozen ghosts on the battlefield. The Luftwaffe airlift wasn't just logistical, it was a battle for every life, and every lost flight meant more frozen bodies scattered across the ice. What began as a promise of salvation turned into a deadly dance with fate, where every pilot, every paratrooper, and every soldier depended on precision, luck, and courage to survive the frozen nightmare that was Demjansk. The horror of the deadly flights also had a profound psychological side. Pilots and soldiers knew that death could come at any moment, from a burst of machine gun fire, a frozen engine, or a plane suddenly crashing. With each mission completed, survival felt more like a miracle than an achievement. What was at stake was not just the lives of the pilots, but of thousands of encircled soldiers. Each successful flight was a temporary victory against the deadly winter, the Soviet enemy, and death itself, keeping the tenuous thread of hope alive amid the frozen nightmare of Demjansk. Hitler's decision to hold the pocket at all costs, relying exclusively on the airlift, was an act of strategic stubbornness that, while it worked at Demjansk, set a dangerous precedent that would be tragically repeated at Stalingrad. The relief and legacy of Demjansk, a symbol of sacrifice, strategic error, and a dark omen. The Demjansk Pocket was finally relieved on April 21, 1942, when a German, Relief force under General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach managed to break the Soviet encirclement and establish a land corridor for the trapped troops. However, the battle for Demjansk was far from over. The corridor was narrow and constantly threatened by Soviet attacks, and the struggle to keep it open continued for months. The final evacuation of the Demjansk salient did not occur until February 1943, a year after the siege began. The legacy of Demjansk is complex and multifaceted. For the Germans, it was a tactical victory, but a strategic defeat. The tenacious resistance of the encircled troops and the success of the Luftwaffe airlift were celebrated as a triumph of German will and ingenuity. However, the cost in lives and materiel was immense, and the battle diverted crucial resources from other fronts. More importantly, the success of Demjansk created a false sense of security in the German high command, leading to the fatal belief that any pocket could be supplied indefinitely from the air. This belief would have disastrous consequences at Stalingrad, where a similar situation, but on a much larger scale, led to the annihilation of the German Sixth Army. For the Soviets, Demjansk was a missed opportunity. Although they failed to destroy the encircled German forces, the battle immobilized a significant number of enemy troops for over a year, preventing their use on other fronts. The experience gained at Demjansk was also valuable for the development of encirclement and annihilation tactics, which would be successfully employed in later battles. Ultimately, the Demjansk Pocket remains a grim symbol of the brutality of the Eastern Front, a testament to the sacrifice of tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides, and a stark reminder of the dangers of strategic stubbornness and overestimating one's capabilities. It was a battle that, though often overshadowed by larger engagements like Stalingrad and Kursk, played a crucial role in shaping the course of the war in the East and left a lasting legacy of suffering, heroism, and strategic error. The forgotten wounded. As the siege of Demjansk continued, the wounded a constant and painful presence. Every explosion, every rifle shot or grenade left more men injured, and the cold turned common wounds into death sentences. Gangrene and frostbite advanced too quickly, and what little could be done was often insufficient. Makeshift hospitals, snow-covered tents, and destroyed buildings became scenes of horror. Doctors and nurses did everything they could to save lives, but resources were scarce. Amputations were performed without anesthesia, with cold knives and trembling hands, while the men screamed in pain. Many died during the procedure. Others simply froze immediately afterward, body and soul abandoned to the winter. The suffering of the wounded was not only physical. Loneliness and despair gnawed at the mind. Men looked at their fallen comrades and felt their own fate reflected in that lost gaze. Some even abandoned any attempt to resist, sitting in the snow to wait for death to come. Even the strongest soldiers felt helpless. The cold hampered rapid movement, weapons froze, and every step toward medical help became a deadly challenge. The enemy didn't need to be right beside them. Snow, ice, and gangrene were their true executioners. In Demjansk, the wounded were forgotten by the world, making it clear that war didn't just kill on the front lines, but also in the silence of frozen tents. Survival wasn't just about avoiding bullets, but about enduring the deadly combination of cold, hunger, and wounds, where every minute could be your last. The war of attrition. As winter and hunger wore down the men, the fighting around Demjansk turned into a war of attrition, slow, bloody, and relentless. Every village, every forest, every road was fought over with hand-to-hand combat, bayonet to bayonet, explosions and grenades. There was no rapid advance, just a constant shedding of blood to maintain minimum positions. Exhausted German soldiers fought against both the visible and invisible enemy, the freezing cold that paralyzed their hands and feet. Soviet soldiers advanced with determination, often crawling through the snow to the enemy trenches, attacking with improvised grenades and relentless fire. Each offensive cost dozens, sometimes hundreds of lives. But the terrain changed little. The towns and villages became scenarios of total destruction burned out. Houses, frozen bodies strewn across the streets, tanks stuck in the snow, all contributed to the chaos. The fight was no longer just for territory, but for survival itself. Every inch of land conquered was paid for in blood. The weather compounded the horror. Snowstorms hid mines and booby traps, delayed reinforcements, and isolated detachments, making every engagement unpredictable and deadly. Every soldier knew that falling meant near certain death, not only from the Soviets, but also from the merciless cold. In Demjansk, the war of attrition turned men into ghosts of ice and blood, fighting for every meter, every supply, every chance to see the next day. It was a hell where courage needed to be constant, and death was always lurking, the hope of breaking the siege. Despite the hunger, the cold, and the daily massacre, inside the Demjansk Pocket, there was still a pulsar spark of hope, the possibility of breaking the Soviet encirclement. German officers studied maps stained with snow and blood, drawing up desperate plans to open an escape corridor. There were rumors among the soldiers that the liberation offensive was being prepared outside. The promise of fresh companies, tanks, and artillery coming their way kept many on their feet, even when their bodies were already on the verge of collapse. This hope, however, had a bitter taste. With each passing day, more men fell before rescue could arrive. The attempts to break away were brutal. Night attacks were organized, with soldiers advancing silently through the snow, but they soon turned into scenes of screams, gunfire, and blood splattered in the winter white. Each time they seemed to break through, new Soviet forces surged forward like a wall of steel, and men determined not to let anyone escape. Still, every survivor harbored within them the vision of seeing the heavens open, of seeing columns of tanks advancing to rescue them, of feeling the warmth of a hot meal. It was a fragile hope, but it was all that remained. For many, it was the only reason to don't lie in the snow and wait for death. Demjansk was a never-ending nightmare, but that hope, however small, was the thread that kept thousands of soldiers alive. They knew if the siege were broken, there would be salvation. If not, it would be the collective freezing of an entire army. The liberation of Bolsum. After months of hunger, snow and blood, the impossible happened. German forces launched a desperate offensive to open a corridor to Demjansk. From outside, entire divisions advanced against the Soviets, crossing frozen forests and minefields in a march that seemed suicidal. From inside, the encircled men gathered their last strength, preparing to attack in unison. The encounter was devastating. The artillery roared like thunder, cracking the frozen earth. Tanks stuck in the ice were pushed with chains and ropes, while soldiers slid in the snow, throwing grenades and firing with nearly frozen fingers. It was as if nature itself refused to allow liberation. The Soviets resisted fiercely. For them, keeping Demjansk isolated meant one more step toward crushing the Wehrmacht. The trenches turned drivers of blood, each position contested with frontal attacks, bodies piling up in ditches that were once roads. But in March 1942, the corridor was finally opened. German troops from abroad managed to reach the besieged, and the supply line was restored, albeit fragile and constantly threatened. For the men inside the pocket, it was like being reborn. Many wept as reinforcements arrived, while others, too exhausted, simply collapsed in the snow, unable to believe they had survived the inferno. However, liberation was not a glorious victory. The price was colossal. Tens of thousands dead, maimed, and missing. The surrounding villages were devastated, and the survivors bore in their eyes the weight of those who had walked side by side with death. Demjansk had been liberated, but at such a high cost that the word victory seemed an insult. In the face of the massacre, the legacy of blood, the liberation of the pocket did not erase the scars. On the contrary, it left behind a field of horrors that would never be forgotten. When the survivors marched out of Demyansk, they seemed living shadows with tattered uniforms, sunken eyes, and faces marked by cold and hunger. They were men who had fought against the enemy, but also against nature itself, and almost all of them had lost friends, brothers in arms, pieces of their own souls. For the Wehrmacht, the siege of Demyansk was shown as a test of endurance and courage, a victory against all odds. But within the army, the officers knew the truth. It was a triumph that had come at a great cost. Tens of thousands of soldiers would never return, and many of those who did carried physical and mental scars for the rest of their lives. The Soviets, for their part, saw Demyansk as a harbinger. They understood that, even surrounded, the Germans could hold out for months, as long as the air maintained a minimum of supplies. This lesson would be vital for the future of the war, especially at Stalingrad. As for the common soldiers, their legacy was made of bitter memories. Endless nights listening to the screams of comrades freezing to death, days when the snow hid mangled bodies, meals made of hardened breadcrumbs. Many were never able to speak of what they experienced, for words were insufficient to describe the white hell of Demyansk. In the end, the pocket became an ambiguous symbol. For some, heroic resistance; for others, a frozen cemetery where thousands were sacrificed in the name of a brutal strategy. What remained was only blood frozen in the snow and the silence of the dead that no one could bury. The frozen nightmare. The siege of Demyansk ended, but for the men who survived, the nightmare never ended. They had stared death in the eye for months on end, in a winter that seemed eternal, and even after liberation, the war continued. Many never recovered from what they saw. Friends frozen to their feet, soldiers screaming in pain as gangrene ate away at their legs, entire ranks decimated by enemy fire or simply by the murderous cold. The miracle of Demyansk, as Nazi propaganda called it, was actually a hell disguised as victory. The Luftwaffe had managed to keep men alive with airdrops, but at the cost of thousands of pilots, tons of resources, and the illusion that this method could be replicated in other sieges. This false confidence would be vindicated at Stalingrad, when tens of thousands of Germans would be abandoned to the same frozen fate. For the Soviets, Demyansk was a lesson in persistence. Even in the face of immense losses, they learned to press on to the limit, using winter as their ally. For the Germans, it was a cruel reminder that the war in the East would not be won quickly, but would drain men, blood, and courage until their last breath. Demyansk was recorded as the frozen nightmare of the Wehrmacht, a tomb of snow and blood, where thousands remained forever. Those who emerged alive carried within them invisible scars, the reminder that in the siege there were no heroes, only survivors and the dead. And so the Demjansk Pocket went down in history, not just as a military episode, but as a symbol of human suffering taken to the limit, where nature itself joined forces with war to transform the battlefield into a white hell. Years later, when the war was over, Demjansk continued to speak in silence. Soviet farmers still found frozen bones beneath the hardened earth, rusted helmets, shattered trunks, broken bayonets, all scattered like open scars on the ground. It was as if the snow still hid the mourning of the dead, frozen in time. Veterans who survived the siege were rarely able to talk about what they experienced. Many carried nightmares, reliving the screams of freezing comrades or the cracking of bones under the weight of the ice. Demjansk had become more than a battle. It was a mark etched in the minds of those who survived, a ghost that would haunt each winter for the rest of their lives. In the collective memory, Demjansk was both a symbol of resistance and senseless suffering. For the Soviets, it was the prelude to crushing the enemy. For the Germans, it was a propaganda victory that cost dearly and taught cruel lessons. But above all, Demjansk became an eternal reminder that in war, true victory never belongs to the generals, but to death. which reaps mercilessly, leaving only echoes in the snow. The siege of Demjansk left deep scars, but it also generated a dangerous mirage. The German command, especially Hitler, came to believe that any siege could be endured as long as the Luftwaffe kept supplies flowing from the sky. This distorted interpretation would be costly, not only for Germany, but for the tens of thousands of soldiers sacrificed in the name of a strategic error. In Demjansk, some 100,000 men were kept alive by air. Each flight was a race against death. Transport pilots dove through snowstorms, dodged Soviet fire, and landed on makeshift runways surrounded by wreckage and frozen corpses. Many planes never returned, shot down by the enemy or swallowed up by the winter. Still, propaganda lauded the feat as a logistical miracle, obscuring the fact that thousands died of hunger, wounds, and cold inside the pocket. Hitler absorbed only the part he wanted. If Demjansk survived, Stalingrad would survive too. When Paulus's Sixth Army was encircled in November 1942, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to repeat the miracle. But Stalingrad was not Demjansk. There were not 100,000 men there, but over 300,000. The winter was even more brutal, the Soviets were better prepared, and the distances were greater. The planes taking off for Stalingrad barely managed to deliver a third of what was needed. Pilots were being shot down like flies. The Luftwaffe's fuel depots were at their limit, and every ton dropped was fought over by starving soldiers like desperate animals. Within the ruined city, men froze to death, starved to death, or in desperate fighting, believing until their last breath that they would be rescued as they had been in Demjansk. But the miracle never came. Stalingrad turned into Germany's greatest military disaster and the beginning of the end of the Wehrmacht. The illusion created by the siege of Demjansk, sold as an example of strength, proved to be a poison that led Germany to underestimate Soviet power and over-rely on the Luftwaffe. Thus, the Demjansk Pocket was not just a frozen nightmare. It was an omen, a shadow cast over Stalingrad, where the price of arrogance would be paid with hundreds of thousands of lives. The siege of Demjansk should have been remembered as a brutal warning. The war in the East was not just against the Red Army, but against nature itself, against hunger and the cold that killed as effectively as a bullet. It should have shown the German command that each victory in the Russian winter cost more than could be recovered. But the lesson was forgotten, or worse, distorted. What should be interpreted as a humanitarian disaster masked by propaganda became an example of resistance to justify even greater risks. Hitler and the High Command saw only the surface. The fact that Demjansk had not fallen. They ignored the thousands of dead, the ghosts who returned mutilated, the suffering of men who survived more through luck and sacrifice than strategy. This blindness was the harbinger of the tragedy at Stalingrad, and ultimately of German ruin on the Eastern Front. The true lesson of Demjansk was not one of hope, but of warning. No army could hold out indefinitely against the Russian winter and millions of determined Soviet soldiers. For the veterans who escaped the pocket, this truth was clear. They knew there was no glory in Demjansk, only blood-stained snow and the memory of comrades frozen in eternal silence. But their voices were drowned out by propaganda, and the cost of arrogance spread through. The war, like a plague, Demjansk in the end was more than a siege. It was a forgotten lesson, and every lesson ignored in war exacts its price in blood. The blood of thousands that months later would flow in the ruins of Stalingrad.